Which? You should have never come. My daughter-in-law's voice cut through the restaurant like something sharp and cold, and a second later, my plate was no longer in front of me but on the floor, my dinner scattered in a quiet, humiliating mess that no one dared to touch, and for a moment no one moved, not the waiter standing a few feet away, not the couple at the next table frozen mid-conversation, not even my own son sitting across from me, staring down at his glass as if the ice cubes swirling inside it were more important than the woman who had raised him for 45 years. And I didn't say a word, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't even look at her right away, because at 72 years old, you learn that the loudest reactions are rarely the strongest ones, and I simply reached for my napkin, folded it once carefully, like I had done 1,000 times at family dinners, and placed it beside the empty space where my plate had been, as if dignity could still be arranged neatly. Even when everything else had fallen apart and I could feel it then, the shift in the room, the weight of people watching without wanting to be seen watching, the kind of silence that hums louder than any argument, and still I did not speak because something in me understood that whatever this moment was, it hadn't started here, not really. This wasn't about a plate of food or a single cruel word thrown across a table in a crowded American restaurant on a Friday evening. This had been building for a long time, in small glances I ignored, in invitations that stopped coming, in conversations that went quiet the moment I entered the room, and as I finally lifted my eyes, I looked not at Ashley, not yet, but at Daniel, my son, the boy I had once held in my arms when he was too afraid to sleep through the night, the boy whose scraped knees I had kissed better, whose college tuition I had paid working double shifts at a clinic that smelled like antiseptic and exhaustion. And he didn't look back at me, not once, not even when Ashley let out a small, dismissive laugh as if what she had just done was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, like spilling a glass of water, and that was when I realized something colder than anger, something heavier than embarrassment, settled quietly in my chest, because this wasn't a misunderstanding, and it certainly wasn't an accident. This was deliberate, planned down to the choice of place, the timing, the audience, and I thought back, just briefly, to earlier that afternoon when I had stood in front of my bedroom mirror, smoothing down the soft blue dress Daniel had once told me made me look elegant, adjusting the silver necklace my late husband had given me on our 30th anniversary, believing foolishly perhaps, that this dinner invitation meant something, that it was an attempt to fix whatever distance had grown between us, that maybe, just maybe, we were going to find our way back to being a family again, and now here I was, standing in a room full of strangers who suddenly knew more about my place in that family than I had allowed myself to admit, and still I did not cry because tears would have made this moment theirs, would have given Ashley exactly what she wanted, proof that she could shake me, break me, reduce me to something small and pitiful in front of everyone, and I had not survived decades of loss, of long nights and harder mornings, just to fall apart in a place where the lighting was too bright and the tables too close together. So instead, I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping softly against the floor, a sound that seemed to echo louder than her voice had just moments before, and I stood steady, composed, as if none of it had touched me, as if I had expected this all along, even though somewhere deep inside, I knew I hadn't, not like this, not so openly, not so unapologetically cruel, and as I reached for my purse, I finally allowed myself one last look at the table, at the son who couldn't meet my eyes and the woman who had just declared, in the clearest way possible, that I was no longer welcome in a space I had once believed was mine, and in that quiet, suspended second I understood something with absolute clarity, something that would change everything that came next, because this was not the moment I was humiliated, this was the moment I saw the truth, and once you see something like that, you can't ever pretend you didn't, and I turned, not in anger, not in defeat, but in something far more dangerous than either, and I walked away without a single word. I stepped out into the night air, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it felt compared to the noise I had just left behind, even though the street was still alive with passing cars and distant conversations, and for a moment I simply stood there on the sidewalk, my hand resting lightly against the strap of my purse, as if I needed something solid to remind myself that I was still present, still steady, still in control, and I took a slow breath, the kind you take when you are trying to settle something deep inside your chest that has begun to shift in a way you cannot ignore, and I walked toward my car without rushing, without looking back, because there was nothing behind me that I needed to see again, not tonight, and when I reached the driver's side door, I paused just long enough to notice that my hands were not shaking anymore. They were calm, almost unusually calm, As if my body had decided that whatever storm had just passed was not worth reacting to in the way it once might have been, and I opened the door, slid into the seat, and closed it gently, shutting out the world with a soft click that felt more final than it should have. And for a few seconds I did nothing. I did not start the engine. I did not adjust the mirror. I simply sat there and let the silence settle around me, thick and steady, like a blanket I had not realized I needed. And I glanced down at my hands resting in my lap, still faintly marked with a smear of sauce that I had not noticed earlier, and instead of wiping it away immediately, I stared at it, not with disgust, but with a kind of distant awareness, as if it belonged to someone else, someone I used to be, someone who would have rushed to clean it, to fix the small detail, to restore order. But I did not move, because suddenly I understood that nothing about tonight had been accidental, not the invitation, not the choice of restaurant, not even the exact moment when everything had been pushed just far enough to break whatever illusion I had been holding onto. And I leaned back slightly against the seat, letting my head rest for a moment, and I thought about the message Daniel had sent 2 days earlier, short and simple, asking if I would join them for dinner, no explanation, no warmth, just an expectation, and I had said yes without hesitation, because that is what mothers do. We accept even the smallest opening as a chance to rebuild something that feels like it has been quietly slipping away. And I remembered standing in my kitchen earlier that day, debating whether to bring something with me, a dessert perhaps, something homemade, something that might remind them of how things used to be. But I had decided against it, telling myself that this was not that kind of dinner, that this was something different, something more intentional, and now I could see just how right that instinct had been, only not in the way I had hoped. And I reached into the small compartment beside me, pulled out a tissue, and finally wiped my hands clean with slow, deliberate movements, not because I needed to erase the mark, but because I was ready to move forward from the moment itself. And as I folded the tissue and set it aside, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, and I studied it for a second longer than usual, noticing the lines that had deepened over the years, the silver in my hair that I no longer tried to hide, and the expression in my eyes that had changed in a way I could not quite name. It was not sadness, not exactly, and it was not anger either. It was something quieter, something more resolved, like a decision that had been made without needing to be spoken out loud. And I turned the key in the ignition, the engine coming to life with a low, steady hum. And as I pulled out of the parking lot, I did not think about where I had just been. I thought about where I was going, not just in the sense of the road in front of me, but in a way that reached further than that, because for the first time in a long time, I was no longer trying to hold something together that had already chosen to fall apart. And as the restaurant disappeared in my rearview mirror, I realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by their decisions anymore. It would be shaped by mine. And that thought, more than anything else, settled into me with a calm that felt stronger than anything I had felt in years. By the time I reached home, the house was exactly as I had left it that afternoon, quiet, orderly, and waiting in a way that felt almost unfamiliar now, as if I had stepped into a place that belonged to a different version of myself. And I set my purse down on the small table by the door with the same careful motion I had used for years, a habit formed through decades of routine. But tonight there was a slight pause afterward, a moment where I stood still and listened, not for anything specific, just to feel the absence of noise, the absence of tension, the absence of expectation. And I slowly removed my coat, hanging it neatly in the closet, smoothing the sleeve without thinking. Because even now, even after everything, there was a part of me that still moved through life with precision, with intention, with a kind of quiet discipline that no one had ever really noticed. And I walked into the kitchen, turning on the soft overhead light, and the space looked exactly as it always did. Clean counters, a bowl of fruit near the window, a folded dish towel resting beside the sink, and I found myself standing there for a moment longer than necessary, not because I did not know what to do next, but because I was realizing that for the first time in a very long time, I did not have to prepare anything for anyone else. There was no call to make, no message to send, no attempt to smooth over what had happened, and that realization settled into me slowly, like something unfamiliar but not unwelcome. And I moved to the sink, turning on the faucet just enough to hear the steady stream of water, and I rinsed my hands again even though they were already clean, watching the water run over them as if I could wash away not the event itself, but the expectation that had led me there. And as I dried them with the towel, I thought about all the small moments that had come before tonight, the ones I had dismissed or explained away, the times Ashley had corrected me in a tone that sounded polite but felt something else entirely, the way Daniel had started ending our phone calls a little sooner, a little more abruptly, as if there was always somewhere else he needed to be, someone else he needed to please, and I remembered the last holiday dinner I had hosted, how Ashley had rearranged the seating without asking, placing me at the far end of the table in my own home, and I had laughed it off at the time, telling myself it did not matter, that these things were small, insignificant, not worth addressing, and now, standing in my own kitchen, I understood that those moments had not been small at all. They had been signals, quiet and consistent, leading to something that had finally revealed itself in a way that could not be ignored, and I walked into the living room, lowering myself into the armchair near the window, the one where I used to sit in the evenings with a book while my husband watched television, and the memory of him came to me not with sadness, but with a kind of clarity, because he had always been the one who noticed things before I did, the one who would have seen through the politeness, the subtle shifts, the careful distancing, and I could almost hear his voice, steady and certain, reminding me that respect is not something you ask for, it is something that either exists or it does not, and I leaned back in the chair, letting my hands rest on the armrests, and I looked around the room at the photographs on the wall, at the life I had built piece by piece over the years, and I realized that nothing in this space had changed, not really, the only thing that had changed was my understanding of who was allowed to be part of it, and that thought did not bring me anger, it brought me something else entirely, something quieter, something more decisive, and I stood up again, moving with a calm that felt different from before, not heavier but more grounded. And I walked toward the small desk in the corner where I kept my papers, my documents, the details of a life that had always been organized, always accounted for, and as I opened the drawer I did not hesitate, I did not second guess, because for the first time I was not reacting to what had been done to me, I was preparing for what I would do next, and that difference, subtle as it was, changed everything. The drawer opened with a soft, familiar sound, and inside it everything was exactly where I had always kept it, neatly arranged folders, labeled envelopes, a system I had built over years not because anyone asked me to, but because I believed in keeping things in order, in being prepared, in making sure that nothing important was ever left to chance, and I reached in and pulled out the first folder, the one that held the documents to the house, the one I had signed decades ago alongside my husband when we first stepped into what was then an empty structure and imagined it into a home, and I ran my fingers lightly over the edge of the paper, not to read it, not yet, but to feel the weight of it, the quiet certainty it represented, and I sat down at the desk, placing the folder in front of me with a kind of deliberate calm that would have surprised anyone who had seen me just a few hours earlier, because there was no trace of confusion left, no lingering question about what tonight had meant, only a steady awareness that something had shifted permanently, and I opened the folder slowly, scanning the familiar lines, the signatures, the details that had once felt routine but now seemed to carry a different kind of importance. And as I read, I began to recall the conversations that had happened over the past year, the subtle suggestions from Daniel about simplifying things, the casual remarks Ashley had made about how large the house was for one person, how difficult it must be to maintain, how there were better options for someone my age, and at the time I had nodded, smiled even, thinking they were expressing concern, thinking they were looking out for me, but now, sitting there with the documents spread out before me, I could see those words for what they had truly been, not concern but preparation, not care but calculation, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting that realization settle fully into place, because it was not a sudden thought, it was a pattern finally becoming clear, a series of small, carefully placed steps leading to a moment like the one that had just unfolded, and I reached for another folder, this one holding my financial statements, the accounts I had managed on my own since my husband passed, every deposit, every payment, every detail accounted for with the same quiet discipline that had guided me through most of my life, and as I flipped through the pages I remembered the times Daniel had offered to help, the way Ashley had asked questions about access, about convenience, about making things easier for me, and I had declined politely, not out of suspicion but out of habit, because I had always handled my own affairs, and now I understood that those moments had mattered more than I realized, that the boundaries I had kept without even thinking had protected something far more significant than I had known. And I closed the folder gently, placing it beside the first, and I sat there for a moment looking at both of them, not with worry, not with fear, but with a clarity that felt almost steadying, because for the first time since the restaurant, I was no longer replaying what had happened, I was looking forward, considering what needed to be done, and I stood up, walking to the bookshelf where I kept a small collection of business cards, contacts I had gathered over the years, people I had trusted when it came to matters that required more than just personal judgment, and I slid my fingers along the row until I found the one I was looking for, A simple card with a name I recognized immediately, someone who had helped us years ago, someone who understood the value of doing things properly, and I held it for a second, turning it slightly in my hand, as if confirming that this was the next step, not out of doubt but out of intention, and I placed it on the desk beside the folders, aligning it carefully because even in this moment of change, I moved with precision, with control, with a quiet sense of purpose that had not been given to me by anyone else and could not be taken away. And as I looked at everything laid out in front of me, I realized that whatever Ashley had intended, whatever Daniel had allowed, it had not left me powerless. It had only revealed how much of my life was still firmly in my own hands, and that realization did not come with noise or dramatic emotion. It came with something far more enduring, a calm understanding that the next steps would not be rushed, would not be emotional, but would be deliberate, thoughtful, and entirely mine. The next morning arrived without urgency, the sunlight filtering through the curtains in a soft, steady way that made everything look almost unchanged, as if the world had decided that nothing significant had happened the night before, and I moved through my usual routine without rushing, preparing a simple breakfast, pouring coffee into the same cup I had used for years, and sitting down at the small table by the window where I had spent countless mornings planning my day around other people's needs. But today felt different, not because the routine had changed, but because the purpose behind it had shifted, and as I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the surface settle into stillness, I realized that for the first time in a long while, I was not waiting for a call, not expecting a message, not anticipating an apology that I knew would never come in a form that mattered, and that absence of expectation felt lighter than I would have thought, as if something I had been carrying quietly had finally been set down without ceremony, and after finishing my breakfast I stood up, rinsed my cup, and dried it carefully before placing it back in its spot, each movement deliberate, unhurried, because there was no longer any reason to move in reaction to anyone else's timeline, and I walked back to the desk where the folders still rested exactly as I had left them the night before, untouched but no longer uncertain, and I picked up the business card again, reading the name once more, not because I had forgotten it, but because I was acknowledging the step I was about to take, and I reached for the phone, dialing the number with steady fingers, listening to the quiet ring on the other end, and when the voice answered, familiar and professional, I introduced myself calmly, explaining that I would like to schedule a meeting, that there were a few matters I wanted to review, nothing urgent, nothing dramatic, just a need for clarity, and the appointment was set for later that afternoon, simple, efficient, without questions, and I thanked them before ending the call, placing the phone back down with the same care I had used for everything else that morning, and for a moment I stood there not thinking about what had happened, not replaying the restaurant or the words that had been thrown so carelessly, but focusing instead on what I was doing now, on the quiet act of putting things in order, and as I gathered the folders, placing them neatly into my bag, I felt something settle more firmly inside me, a sense of direction that did not need to be announced or justified, and I left the house shortly after, locking the door behind me with a soft click that felt more like a transition than a routine gesture, and the drive across town was calm, the streets familiar, the traffic steady, and I kept my attention on the road, not allowing my thoughts to drift backward because there was nothing there that required revisiting, not anymore. And when I arrived at the office, I parked, stepped out, and walked inside with the same composed pace I had carried since the night before, greeting the receptionist with a polite nod, giving my name, and taking a seat in the waiting area where the quiet hum of the building created a sense of order that matched my own. And when I was called in, I stood, walked into the office and sat down across from the man who had once helped my husband and me make decisions that shaped our future. And as he greeted me, asking how he could assist, I placed the folders on the desk, opening them one by one, not with hesitation but with intention, and I began to speak, not about what had been done to me, not about the scene in the restaurant or the words that had been meant to diminish me, but about what needed to be ensured moving forward, about ownership, about protection, about making certain that every detail of my life remained exactly where it belonged, under my control, and as I spoke, I could see the understanding in his expression, the recognition that this was not a reaction born of impulse, but a decision formed with clarity, and he nodded, taking notes, asking precise questions, and offering options that aligned with what I already knew I wanted. And when the meeting ended, there was no sense of relief, no dramatic shift in emotion, only a quiet confirmation that the path ahead had been set. And as I left the office, stepping back into the afternoon light, I realized that nothing I had done required explanation to anyone else, because for the first time, I was not adjusting my life to fit into someone else's expectations, I was shaping it according to my own. And that difference, subtle as it might have seemed from the outside, was the beginning of something far more permanent than anything that had been taken from me. The drive home felt shorter that afternoon, not because the distance had changed, but because my mind was no longer occupied with questions that had no answers, and as I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, I sat there for a moment with my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not out of hesitation but out of awareness, because I could feel the difference in myself in a way that was subtle yet undeniable. And when I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, the house did not feel empty the way it might have once. It felt settled, grounded, as if it recognized that something within it had been quietly reclaimed, and I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me with the same soft click that now felt familiar, not just as a sound, but as a boundary, a clear separation between what belonged here and what no longer did. And I moved through the hallway, setting my bag down on the table, removing the folders one by one and placing them back into the drawer where they had always been kept, but this time there was a difference in how I handled them, not in the motion itself but in the understanding behind it, because now I knew exactly what each document represented, not just in terms of ownership or legality, but in terms of choice. And I closed the drawer gently, resting my hand on it for a brief moment as if acknowledging that everything inside remained exactly where it should be, untouched, secure, and fully within my control. And I turned toward the kitchen, moving with the same calm pace that had carried me through the entire day, and I prepared a simple dinner for myself, nothing elaborate, just something warm and steady. And as I set the plate on the table and took my seat, I noticed how different this moment felt compared to so many others before it, because there was no underlying tension, no quiet anticipation of interruption, no need to adjust or accommodate. There was only the simple act of sitting down and eating a meal in my own home on my own terms. And I picked up my fork, taking a small bite, not rushing, not distracted, just present. And as I ate, my thoughts did not drift back to the restaurant. They did not return to Ashley's voice or Daniel's silence, because those things no longer required my attention in the way they once might have. Instead, I found myself thinking about the conversation from earlier that day, about the clear, precise way everything had been explained, about the steps that would ensure that nothing in my life could be shifted without my knowledge or consent. And that thought settled into me with a quiet confidence, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, like something that had always been there and was only now fully recognized. And after I finished my meal, I cleared the table, washing the dishes with the same care I had always taken, drying each one before placing it back in its proper place, because there was a comfort in maintaining the order I had built over time, a reminder that not everything needed to be changed, only understood. And when I finished, I turned off the kitchen light and walked into the living room, lowering myself once again into the armchair by the window. And as I sat there, I allowed myself a moment to reflect, not on what had been done, but on what had been revealed, because there is a difference between losing something and seeing it clearly for the first time. And what I had experienced was not a loss, it was clarity, the kind that removes uncertainty without needing to explain itself. And I looked around the room at the photographs, at the small details that had remained constant through years of change, and I realized that nothing here had been diminished, nothing had been taken from me in a way that mattered, because what defined this space, what defined my life, had never been dependent on the approval or presence of anyone else. And as I sat there in the quiet, I felt no urgency to act, no need to confront, no desire to revisit the past, because everything that needed to be set in motion had already begun. And whatever came next would unfold not as a reaction, but as a continuation of a decision that had already been made, one that did not require noise or announcement, only time. And I leaned back slightly, allowing the stillness of the room to settle around me once more, knowing with a certainty that did not need to be spoken that the balance had shifted, and this time it was firmly in my favor. The following morning arrived with the same quiet consistency, but this time there was a subtle shift in the air that I could not ignore. Not because anything had changed externally, but because something had begun to move beneath the surface, something I had set in motion without needing to announce it. And as I stood by the kitchen window holding my coffee, I noticed the faint vibration of my phone against the counter, a sound that once would have immediately pulled my attention, but now I let it continue for a second longer before reaching for it, not out of hesitation but out of choice. And when I picked it up, I saw Daniel's name on the screen, and for a brief moment I simply looked at it. Not with anticipation, not with anxiety, but with a kind of distant recognition, as if I were observing something that no longer had the same hold over me. and I let the call go to voicemail, placing the phone back down gently as the ringing stopped, and I took another sip of my coffee, letting the silence return unbroken and steady, and a few minutes later, the phone buzzed again, this time a message short and carefully worded, asking if everything was all right, as if the events of the previous night could be reduced to a simple misunderstanding, as if a question could smooth over something that had been so clearly revealed, and I read it once, then set the phone aside without responding. Because I understood now that not every message required an answer, not every attempt at contact deserved engagement, and that realization did not come from anger, but from clarity, and I moved through the rest of my morning without interruption, completing small tasks, tidying the living room, organizing a drawer that did not truly need organizing, not because it was necessary, but because there was a quiet satisfaction in maintaining control over the details of my own space. And later that afternoon, as I was arranging a stack of papers on the desk, there was a knock at the door, not loud, not urgent, but deliberate enough to signal that whoever stood on the other side expected to be received, and I paused for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk, not surprised because part of me had anticipated this, not in a specific way, but in the understanding that actions often bring responses, and I walked toward the door at an unhurried pace, each step steady, each movement controlled, and when I reached it, I opened it without hesitation, and there they were, Daniel and Ashley, standing side by side on the porch, their expressions carefully composed, as if they had rehearsed this moment, as if they believed that showing up here would somehow restore what had been broken, and for a second no one spoke, the space between us filled with something that was no longer uncomfortable, but simply factual, and Daniel was the first to shift slightly, his posture uncertain, his eyes searching my face for something familiar, something he could recognize, but what he found instead was not what he expected, because I was not standing there as the person he had last seen, not the one who might have tried to explain or forgive too quickly, and Ashley offered a small, polite smile, the kind that had once passed as sincerity, but now revealed itself as something else entirely, and she began to speak, her tone measured, controlled, explaining that there had been a misunderstanding, that things had gotten out of hand, that emotions had been high, and I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed, but because I no longer needed to correct what was already clear, and when she finished there was a brief silence, the kind that usually invites a response, but I did not fill it immediately, I allowed it to exist, to stretch. Just long enough to make the absence of my reaction noticeable, and when I finally spoke my voice was calm even without sharpness or hesitation, and I simply said that I understood what I had seen, that there was no confusion on my part, and that what mattered now was not what had happened, but what would happen next, and as I stood there, looking at them without anger, without pleading, only with a steady, grounded certainty, I could see it in their expressions, the moment they realized that whatever control they thought they had was no longer there, and that realization, quiet and unspoken, shifted everything in a way that no raised voice ever could. They stood there waiting for something more, perhaps an invitation to come inside, perhaps a softer response that would allow them to step back into a version of this home where nothing had truly changed, but I did not move aside, I did not open the door wider, and I did not offer the kind of reassurance they were used to receiving, because that version of me no longer existed in the way they expected, and Daniel shifted his weight slightly, glancing past me into the house as if searching for something familiar, something unchanged, but all he saw was what had always been there, the quiet order, the steady calm, only now it no longer included him in the way it once had, and Ashley spoke again, her tone softer this time, more measured, explaining that they had been under pressure, that there had been stress, that things had been said in the heat of the moment, and I listened without interruption, not because her explanation held weight, but because I no longer needed to challenge it. The truth had already made itself clear, and when she finished I took a small step forward, not closing the distance between us, but establishing a boundary that did not require explanation, and I told them, calmly and without emphasis, that there would be some changes, that certain decisions had already been made, and that going forward, things would be handled differently, and Daniel's expression shifted at that, the uncertainty in his eyes sharpening into something closer to concern. Because for the first time he was not hearing an attempt to fix what had happened, he was hearing the result of it, and he asked what I meant, his voice careful, controlled, but no longer as steady as before, and I did not rush to answer. I let the question settle between us for a moment, because clarity does not need to be delivered quickly to be understood, and then I explained, simply and directly, that I had reviewed everything, the house, the accounts, the arrangements that had once been left open out of trust, and that those things were no longer open, that they had been secured, adjusted, and placed firmly under my control. And as I spoke, I watched their reactions not with satisfaction, but with quiet observation, because what mattered was not how they felt about it, but that they understood it. And Ashley's posture stiffened slightly, her polite expression tightening just enough to reveal the strain beneath it, while Daniel looked at me in a way I had not seen before, as if he were trying to reconcile the person standing in front of him with the one he thought he knew. And I held his gaze for a moment, not to challenge him, but to make something clear without needing to say it directly. And when I finished, there was silence again, not the uncertain kind from before, but a heavier, more grounded silence that carried meaning on its own. And Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, then hesitated, because whatever he had intended to say no longer fit the situation. And Ashley tried once more, her voice careful, suggesting that perhaps we could sit down, talk things through, find a way to move forward together. And I listened, not with resistance, but with a kind of finality that did not need to be explained. And I told her that moving forward would not look the way it had before, that some things, once seen clearly, cannot be returned to their previous state, and that I would not be discussing those decisions further, not because I was unwilling, but because they were already made. And as I stood there, steady and composed, I could see the shift fully settle in, the moment where they understood that this was not a conversation they could steer, not a situation they could reshape with the right words, and that realization, quiet and unmistakable, changed the space between us in a way that no argument ever could. And after a brief pause, I nodded once, not as an invitation but as a conclusion, and I stepped back just enough to close the door, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with the same calm precision that had guided every decision I had made since the moment I walked out of that restaurant. And as the door shut, separating what was mine from what no longer was, I knew that nothing about this had been impulsive, nothing had been driven by emotion alone, it had been shaped by clarity, and that clarity would carry forward into whatever came next. The house grew quiet again after the door closed, not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that feels complete, as if something unfinished had finally been resolved without needing to be discussed any further. And I stood there for a moment with my hand still resting lightly on the door, not listening for footsteps outside, not wondering if they would knock again, because I already knew they would not in the same way, not with the same certainty they had arrived with. And I turned slowly, walking back into the living room with the same steady pace that had carried me through everything since that night. And I lowered myself into the chair by the window once more, the familiar space now feeling different in a way that was difficult to describe, not because anything had changed physically, but because the meaning of it had shifted. And I let my hands rest on my lap, looking out at the quiet street where nothing seemed out of place, cars passing, a neighbor walking their dog, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing without interruption. And I realized that this was what I had returned to, not a loss, not an absence, but a life that had always been mine, one that no longer required approval, permission, or validation from anyone else. And my thoughts did not return to the restaurant, not to the words that had been spoken or the way the room had gone still, because those moments had already served their purpose. They had revealed what needed to be seen, and once something is seen clearly, it does not need to be revisited to remain understood. And instead I found myself thinking about the years behind me, not with regret, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, the years spent building, giving, adjusting, believing that keeping peace was the same as preserving connection. And I understood now that there is a difference between those things, that peace built on silence is not the same as respect, and that understanding settled into me with a calm certainty that did not need to be defended or explained. And I stood up after a while, moving toward the hallway, turning off the lights one by one as evening began to settle in, not out of habit alone, but because there was something grounding in the simple act of closing a day properly. And I paused briefly at the desk, glancing at the drawer where everything had been placed back into order, not because I needed to check it, but because I recognized what it represented, not just documents or decisions, but the quiet shift of ownership, not only of things but of direction. And I continued down the hallway, preparing for the night in the same measured way I had approached everything else. And when I finally lay down, the house around me was still, steady, unchanged, and for the first time in a long time, there was no weight pressing against my thoughts, no need to replay conversations or imagine different outcomes, because everything that needed to happen had already begun, and whatever came next would not arrive as a surprise, it would arrive as a continuation of something I had chosen. and as I closed my eyes, I understood something with a clarity that did not need words, that they had believed I would remain. Where they had placed me, quiet, accommodating, easy to move around when it suited them, but they had misunderstood something fundamental, something they would only now begin to realize, because I had not walked away from that moment diminished, I had walked away with something far more valuable, and that was the certainty that I was no longer standing inside a life shaped by their expectations, I was standing firmly inside one shaped by my own, and that difference, invisible to anyone who had not lived it, would be the one thing they could never take back, no matter how many times they returned to that door, or how carefully they chose their words, because the version of me they had tried to dismiss no longer existed, and what remained was something they had never truly understood in the first place.